You have Canada. It's so great to have, in fact, the president called and he wanted to know if it's worthwhile. He knew exactly what it was. He knew the importance. Where's Canada, by the way? Where are you? Where are you? And I appreciate you being here very much, Mr. President. Fantastic. Fantastic. Thanks. So you going back?
I'll go back. I'm glad you upgraded me to president.
Did I say?
At a summit in Egypt, cameras caught a moment that said more than any speech could. As Donald Trump addressed world leaders, he casually referred to Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney as the President of Canada. The room went silent for a beat before laughter rippled through the crowd. Carney, calm and composed, smiled and replied that he was glad to be upgraded. It was a light moment on the surface, but underneath it told a deeper story. The United States, once the anchor of global leadership, now looked distracted and defensive. The scene captured how Washington's influence is beginning to slip while others quietly move forward. That exchange wasn't about humor. It reflected how much the global balance has changed. While Trump continues to govern through tariffs and confrontation, his allies are learning to adapt without him. And nowhere is that more visible than in the shifting trade map now surrounding the United States. By mid-October 2025, Washington's tariff spiral had started to rebound on itself. Trump's new 100% duties on Chinese goods triggered a wave of countermeasures far beyond Beijing. China not only expanded its rare earth export limits, but also coordinated quietly with other suppliers, from Indonesia to Kazakhstan, to tighten the flow of battery metals and refined nickel. Within days, global prices for key minerals used in electric vehicles rose nearly 30%, according to the London Metal Exchange. Across the Pacific, U.S. allies began signaling fatigue. Japan and South Korea, both recently pressured to sign investment-heavy trade frameworks with Washington, openly called for predictable and rules-based trade. The European Commission warned that American protectionism was now a systemic risk to global recovery. For manufacturers worldwide, the shock was immediate. German automakers slowed exports to the U.S. Korean chip makers redirected orders toward India, and ASEAN economies expanded intra-Asian trade to insulate themselves from U.S. volatility. Even inside America, frustration grew. The National Retail Federation reported that import costs on consumer goods had jumped 14% since summer, while the Federal Reserve noted continued pressure on inflation despite slower demand. What was intended as a show of strength has become a global rallying point against U.S. tariffs. Instead of bending others to Washington's will, Trump's trade policy is driving them to unite and to trade more with each other. While the U.S. became trapped in multiple trade fights, Canada quietly redrew its own map of alliances. After months of tense talks with Washington that produced no relief on steel, aluminum, or autos, Ottawa moved on to new partnerships. In New Delhi, Canada and India signed a new roadmap for relations in early October 2025. The agreement restarted cooperation on critical minerals, renewable energy, and technology after years of frozen ties. India's Foreign Ministry confirmed the relaunch of the Canada-India Joint Science and Technology Committee and a revived CEO Forum to facilitate cross-border investment. This deal marks the first real thaw since diplomatic tensions in 2023. For Canada, it opens a gateway into South Asia at a time when global manufacturers are shifting supply chains away from China and the U.S. At the same time, Ottawa began to reassess its economic stance with Beijing. Canada should reopen talks with China, especially after Chinese officials offered to lift tariffs on Canadian canola and agricultural goods if Ottawa allowed electric vehicle imports. Those vehicles, priced around 35,000 Canadian dollars, could make Canada's EV market more competitive and lower costs for consumers. Domestically, the Carney government also launched a major industrial program. Industry Minister Melanie Joly's $5 billion plan aims to rebuild manufacturing capacity in clean technology, battery metals, and advanced materials. Ontario, still reeling from U.S. auto tariffs, is leveraging its cheap energy and abundant nickel and cobalt to attract new investment. These steps signal a turning point. Canada is not waiting for Washington's approval anymore. It is diversifying its trade base, expanding eastward toward Asia and southward toward emerging markets. As one Canadian analyst put it this week, while Washington is building tariff walls, Ottawa is quietly building bridges. Trump's tariff experiment was designed to make America strong again. Instead, it has pushed allies away and strengthened the very competitors Washington wanted to contain. The United States is now surrounded by a network of former partners: Canada, the EU, India, Japan, who are rewriting their trade relationships without American leadership. Each of these economies is deepening cooperation in areas once dominated by the U.S.: clean energy, automotive supply chains, and critical minerals. According to the World Trade Organization's latest briefing, global tariff retaliation against U.S. measures now covers over 40% of American exports. The cost is spreading back through U.S. industries, from furniture to heavy machinery. In Michigan and Ohio, where factories rely on Canadian steel, operating margins have fallen by double digits since August. Even Wall Street has taken notice. Analysts at Goldman Sachs estimate that American consumers now shoulder about 55% of all tariff costs through higher prices, a number consistent with patterns seen during the 2018 trade war. Meanwhile, Canada's approach of diversification is beginning to pay off. With new energy and technology partnerships in India and ongoing talks with China, Ottawa has positioned itself as a bridge between Western and Asian markets. Foreign direct investment in Canada rose nearly 9% this quarter, according to Statistics Canada. For the first time in decades, the economic gravity of North America is shifting north of the border. Trump's America First now risks becoming America Alone. The tariffs that were meant to protect domestic industry are driving companies to relocate production and diversify supply chains elsewhere. The symbolism of that moment in Egypt comes full circle. A president mistook a prime minister for another head of state, and the world laughed. But behind the laughter was a recognition that something fundamental had changed. America is no longer the unquestioned center of global trade. Its closest neighbors have learned to compete, and its rivals have learned to cooperate. Trump's tariffs were never just about economics. They were about power. And now that power is turning inward, leaving room for others, Canada included, to lead in ways Washington no longer can.
A stark new warning from the Energy Department. According to new projections, Americans could face up to 800 hours of blackouts per year by 2030. That's more than a month without power, and it's raising some questions about the reliability of our electric grid.
And residents on the Sunshine Coast say they're against sending all the power from a local dam to the U.S. for 30 years.
In British Columbia, a single proposal has turned into a national story. Powell River Energy has asked Canada's energy regulator for a license to export power to the United States for the next 30 years. That would lock in supply until 2055. But what seemed routine quickly drew heavy opposition from residents, local business groups, and the Tla'amin First Nation. For Americans, the timing is striking. Washington is counting on Canadian energy to balance out shortages created by high costs and delays in its own projects. Instead of certainty, the United States is now watching as a long-term deal stumbles at the very first hurdle. The dam in Powell River once powered a paper mill that operated for more than a century. When the mill closed in 2021, the company shifted output south. What looked like an easy export is now tangled in questions about local development and energy sovereignty. This is where a regional dispute intersects directly with the larger politics of Trump's tariff era. Donald Trump's tariff program was meant to reinforce American control over supply chains, yet the result has been the opposite in many sectors, including energy. Duties of 25% to 50% on steel and aluminum raised construction costs for utilities, while added tariffs on copper and other metals slowed investment in new transmission lines and renewable projects. The U.S. Department of Energy reported in its summer 2025 review that grid expansion targets are already falling behind schedule. Those delays have made imports from Canada more valuable. Washington assumed those imports would be secure, but the Powell River case shows the weakness in that assumption. Canada is no longer treating electricity as an unlimited export. Communities and provincial agencies are pressing to keep more power at home. Trump's trade war has therefore created an energy paradox. By pushing up the cost of domestic projects, his tariffs make America more dependent on outside supply. And at the same time, they give Canada every reason to tighten its grip on what it sells abroad. The opposition in Powell River is not symbolic. The Tla'amin First Nation and the Cranberry Business Group are redeveloping the mill site, and their pitch to investors includes reliable access to local power. Residents have organized through Energy Democracy for BC, warning that no one can predict what the region's energy needs will be in 2055. Even the provincial utility, BC Hydro, has filed for access under federal fair market rules. This fight connects to a broader trend. Ottawa has launched major nation-building projects in energy and resources, from liquefied natural gas terminals in the Atlantic to cobalt refining in Ontario. These initiatives share a common goal: to capture more of the value chain inside Canada. The longer Trump pushes tariffs across the border, the stronger the incentive for Canada to build industries that use its own resources rather than shipping them to the United States. Powell River is one community, but its debate mirrors the direction of national policy. For the White House, the implications go beyond one license application. U.S. manufacturers in border states already face higher costs for power-intensive production. If Canada restricts long-term electricity exports, those costs will climb further. Trump's strategy was designed to assert leverage, but it has created the opposite dynamic. Canada is learning to conserve its own energy and resources, while the United States finds itself increasingly short of reliable supply. The Powell River proposal is still under review, with a new deadline for public feedback set for October 4. Yet the larger message is clear. A policy of tariffs and pressure was meant to guarantee American strength. Instead, it has encouraged Canadian communities to resist long-term deals and hold on to what they have. What began as a local dispute now stands as another example of how Trump's approach to trade and energy is backfiring, leaving the United States facing harder choices about its own security. President Trump stood before the world's leaders and sneered.
It's the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world, in my opinion. Best-selling hat. Trump was right about everything. And I don't say that in a braggadocious way, but it's true. I've been right about everything.
Donald Trump returned to the United Nations this September, but instead of a serious diplomatic moment, it became a spectacle. He opened by complaining about an escalator, telling delegates,
I ended 7 wars, dealt with the leaders of each and every one of these countries, and never even received a phone call from the United Nations. All I got from the United Nations was an escalator that on the way up stopped right in the middle.
What followed was nearly an hour of bravado and insult. At one point, he declared,
Countries are going to hell.
The scene drew laughter and headlines, but for all the wrong reasons. What was supposed to be leadership on the world stage came across as grievance and performance. While Trump was absorbed in this one-man show in New York, another story was unfolding across the border. The American economy, particularly in industries tied to Canada, was showing real signs of strain. The contradictions in his speech were glaring. He called climate policy a sham, insisting,
If you don't get away from this green scam, your country is going to fail.
He mocked the UN as ineffective, saying,
And now all they seem to do is write a really strongly worded letter and then never follow that letter up.
Yet in a private meeting just afterward, he switched tone, telling the Secretary General,
Our country is behind the United Nations 100%. I think the potential of the United Nations is incredible, really incredible.
This disconnect is not just about words, it reflects a broader pattern. The reciprocal tariff regime rolled out earlier this year was supposed to restore fairness, but it has left scars with America's closest allies. Canada, facing duties on steel, aluminum, and autos, has not only resisted but also pulled back in ways that strike at everyday economic ties. Public opinion north of the border has soured, and that shift is now visible in the numbers.
Canadians continue to shun the U.S. We've heard from U.S. travel operators, tour operators just across the border, upstate New York or those northern states, are feeling the impact of not having as many Canadians traveling south of the border, particularly during the busy and all-important summer travel months.
Statistics Canada reported in July 2025 that Canadian return trips from the United States dropped more than 32% compared with July 2024. Car trips, usually day visits for shopping or gas, were down 35%. Air travel fell 16%. For the second consecutive month, more Americans traveled to Canada than Canadians to the U.S., reversing a long-standing trend. This matters because Canada has been the single largest source of foreign visitors to the U.S. According to the U.S. Travel Association, Canadians made about 20 million visits in 2024, generating around $20 billion in spending and supporting more than 140,000 American jobs. With travel now falling, those dollars and jobs are disappearing. The impact is already visible. Tour operators in upstate New York and the northern Midwest say bookings are weak. Air Canada reported that revenue on its U.S. routes fell by 11% in the second quarter of 2025. Local business owners in small towns along the border also report emptier parking lots, weaker restaurant traffic, and a sharp drop in retail sales compared with last summer. Each of these figures points to the same reality. Tariffs and tension have created a boycott effect that is costing Americans real income. Trump built his second term on promises of strength. At the UN, he declared,
Trump was right about everything.
Yet the evidence shows otherwise. Tariffs meant to pressure Canada are instead draining American communities. Tourism, airlines, and border economies are suffering precisely because of policies meant to protect them. The irony is stark. While Trump made headlines for taunting world leaders in New York, the real story was happening quietly across the northern border. Canadians are staying home, billions of dollars in spending are evaporating, and American jobs are on the line. The spectacle at the UN may have satisfied a taste for confrontation, but the cost is measured in livelihoods. What was meant to project strength is instead turning into one of the clearest examples of a policy backfire.